Hey, good morning again. This is Peggy Fisher with episode 5, The Senator from the South. The Senator from the South. You want to pay attention to chapter 5. The restaurant was bustling at 8 p.m. as Helen made her way across the crowded restaurant to the booth on the far corner of the large room where Gabby was seated. Relieved to see a familiar face amongst the crowd, Helen took a deep breath as she relaxed into the booth and taking a seat across from Gabby. The woman ordered cocktails and dinner. Huddled in the booth on the perimeter of the restaurant, they were an eye-catching pair. Even if you didn't know who they were, you were drawn to them due to their striking good looks and the air of confidence they both exuded. Across the main dining room where the women sat, perched on his favorite bar stool, sat the senator from the South. He was engaged in a pleasant banter with a young admin he had met earlier in the day when his attention drifted toward the booth in the back of the restaurant. It was the flash of a camera that caught his attention, but it was the older woman and her younger female companion that kept his focus. He knew the older woman, but he couldn't quite place her. He thought he might know He knew the older woman, but he couldn't quite place her. He thought he might know the older woman's younger companion. She did look familiar, but he wasn't quite sure. Just at the moment when it was about to crystallize who the woman in the corner booth were, his younger companion placed a suggestive kiss on his cheek and he signaled the bartender that he wanted to settle the tab. The senator from the South was a regular at Le Diplomate, and the bartender was familiar with the senator's routine. When he had first started bartending at Le Diplomate, he took note of the senator from the South because he had commented to another bartender about the bevy of young, beautiful women the senator from the South would bring into the bar each night. And the other bartender's response was, "Yep," and his wife's a looker too. Oblivious to what was taking place across the room, Gabby and Helen were comparing notes from the day's activity. Gabby, as promised, used every news source she could think of to gain any information she could about the FBI and police investigation into Senator Baldwin's death. Considering the time she had spent on the Hill and how well she was liked, Gabby had a lot of sources, and she tapped them all. But she came up empty. Helen's assignment was to get as close to the White House inner circle as possible to determine what they knew, but she too came up empty. Both women picked up their wine glasses, took a sip, and sank defeated into the booth. As the two women sat across the booth from each other, staring off into the distance, they were independent in their thoughts as they tried to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Perplexed, vexed, and then relieved, they simultaneously came to the same conclusion. By sleeping with Senator Baldwin, Helen had inadvertently landed herself smack dab in the middle of a Washington cover-up. It was the only logical explanation. Logical because there weren't any loose ends to follow up on. No one misspoke. No one made a gaffe. Everyone they spoke to was on the same page, and a formal investigation was being led by the FBI, which was working closely with the D.C. Metro Police. The FBI's and D.C. Metro Police cantankerous relationship was legendary. The fact that these two institutions were working together on a case was a red flag. Gabby's career was steeped in Washington cover-ups, starting with the Kennedy administration. Despite a 25-year deadline established in 1992 JFK Records Collection Act, to date, not everything has come out regarding the JFK's assassination. In October 2017, 2,800 files about the 1963 murder was made public for the first time, but still some material will be kept from the public due to, quote, identifiable national security, law enforcement, and foreign affairs concerns, end of quote, according to the White House memo. President Nixon's cover-up, arguably still the most famous cover-up in political history, was the Watergate scandal. On a Sunday, 5 men broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. in a botched operation. President Bill Clinton's name will forever be linked to Monica Lewinsky. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal involved a then 49-year-old President Clinton and 22-year-old White House intern Monica Lewinsky. Further investigation into their relationship led to the charges of perjury and to the impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998. Then, of course, there was the Reagan-Iran-Contra and Johnson's disinformation regarding the scope of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. Gabby had a front row seat for it all. Helen was confident she was witnessing another Washington cover-up, but there was no reason to overreact. Between the two, they had the experience and context to handle whatever life sent their way. Besides, Helen felt this might be material for another Pulitzer, if she and Gabby could find some answers, and if it didn't land her in jail in the process. Helen took another sip of her wine and bit into the Bergen's American the waiter had just delivered, and as the juices trickled out of the corners of her mouth, she reached for one of her napkins. At that moment, life was good. Helen was enjoying the last bite of milk chocolate pot de cream which they had decided to split when she felt a tap on her left shoulder. When she turned and glanced up, she found the senator from the South grinning down on her. Southerners in general often draw one-syllable words into two syllables. They tend to keep the bottom jaw loose. They only open their mouth as far as they have to. Their bottom lip stays as still as humanly possible. They overemphasize vowels at every opportunity. They drop any letter at will, and they never use one syllable when four would do. Helen didn't immediately recognize the senator from the South, but the minute he opened his mouth, she recognized his almost stereotypical Southern accent, and the memories came rushing back. It was the day she had gotten offered the job at the White House when she had inadvertently slammed into the senator from the South and landed on her slender buttocks to the amusement of all who witnessed the collision. With the memories flooding her mind and overwhelming her senses, Helen was now frozen in time. It was here that she and the senator from the South had come for a drink. It was here that she later deduced he had spiked her drink. And it was here she learned the tough lessons every young woman learns. Do not leave a bar with a man you just met. Prior to this moment, she had never tried the restaurant and the events of that night. She had never tied the restaurant and the events of that night together. Now a regular herself at the restaurant, it never crossed her mind until she looked up at the senator from the South and into his crystal blue eyes that it was him here at this restaurant. It was this chance meeting in the long hallway which had led to her hugging the toilet bowl in the ladies' room off the long hall, and it was all that in turn that had facilitated her meeting Gabby. Helen was no longer interested in her scrumptious dessert. She was interested in landing a right hook on the senator's chin. With great resistance, she kept her clenched fist in her lap and instead forged confusion as to who this person might be, asking from where she might know him. The senator from the South was obviously deflated at last response. Let me try that one again. Helen was no longer interested in her scrumptious dessert. She was interested in landing a right hook on the senator's chin. With great restraint, she kept her clenched fist in her lap and instead fudged confusion as to who this person might be, asking from where she might know him. The senator from the South was obviously deflated at that response. Helen was not a vengeful person, but it felt so sweet to know she had obviously wounded the senator's ego. It was to her advantage not to open the Pandora's box that lashing out accusations over her appalling experience with the senator from the South would have created. So Helen suppressed her emotions and gave a warning glance at Gabby to do the same. The senator from the South, clearly at a loss for what to say, muttered, "I'm sorry for the intrusion," turned and went back to his companion. The senator from the South and the young lady soon left the restaurant. Gabby suggested that lacking any concrete information, she and Helen adjourned to Helen's nearby apartment and put together a list of likely suspects in killing of Senator Baldwin. They used Helen's empty wall and Post-it notes to create a suspect board. First up was Speaker of the House, who had made no secret of his tremendous disdain for the senator, particularly the legislation the senator had introduced to put a cap on term limits. The Speaker was now in his fourth term and looked to continue indefinitely. Next, William Carster, who stood to go broke at the Senate Committee of Homeland Security and Government Affairs, which Baldwin chaired, succeeded in limiting the arms deal Carstairs absolutely needed to broker. Next, the chair of the White House of Political Affairs, who had lobbied hard against Baldwin as the VP pick, wanting instead the candidate who had promised him a more prominent role should he be picked, or the developer who needed access to certain Indian land for a major project which Baldwin had blocked. And of course, there are the many criminals that Baldwin had put in prison during his stint as a U.S. attorney. The list was becoming exhaustive, but would any of these suspects actually commit murder? This was Washington. This was politics. These clashes were an everyday occurrence. Discouraging, the list of suspects was infinite. It was early morning hours of the next day when Gabby finally left Helen's studio apartment. Exhausted and drained, Helen closed the door behind Gabby as the two women said goodnight. As soon as Helen turned the deadbolt and felt the safety of its loud click, her thoughts went directly into the serendipitous meeting with the senator from the South earlier that evening, and she was suddenly wide awake. Helen sat down on the couch and let her thoughts drift to an early event that took place in her life. Seeing the senator from the South had reminded her of it. She recalled when she was 12 years old and had gotten pregnant by Tommy. She had no idea how her father found out they had had sex. She didn't even know how she was pregnant until her father forced her to take a pregnancy test. She had felt a little nauseous but never entertained the thought that it was more than a flu. After all, it was her first time having sex and she was only 12. She couldn't get pregnant. Or so she thought. It was also her first appointment to a gynecologist when she went to have a D&C abortion. All she remembered of the events that took place that day was she was allowed to stay home from school the following day due to cramping. The following week, her father came into her bedroom and in silence handed her a pink case full of birth control pills. After he left her room, they never talked about what took place and she never gave it a conscious thought one way or another. It was a different decade and a half later. She was different. She thought she knew she did not want to have children and took precautions to make sure that she did not get pregnant. Although she supported the pro-choice movement and she was an advocate for legal access to induced abortion services, she had decided another abortion would not be right for her. So she thought. So she took precautions. Now, sitting on the couch, her thoughts drifted to yet another time in her life when she thought she was pregnant, the day she met Gabby. She was overwhelmed with emotions in the morning. Gabby found her hugging the commode. One minute she was crying because she didn't want to be pregnant. The next minute she was smiling because although her childhood was a nightmare after her mother died, the thought of having a child and shaping another human being had its appeal. Then the reality of a single mom trying to raise a child on her own in Washington, D.C. would set in and the sobbing would begin again. But she thought if she combined her stunning good looks and the senator's dashing good looks, then the boy or girl would be adorable. However, she couldn't shake the loudest thought that she had already had one abortion forced upon her. Was she really going to make the decision on her own to have another? Helen wasn't familiar with the details of the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, but she did know enough to appreciate that if that case hadn't been tried in front of the Supreme Court and that the court had not ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects the pregnant woman's liability to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restrictions, she wouldn't have any choice or control over her own body at this moment in time. Having a choice and having control over her own body was very important to Helen, especially now. It was at that moment in time when she felt a strong but comforting small hand on her left shoulder. After wiping her mouth clean from the last bout of heaving, Helen turned around slowly to see what appeared to be an angel. Actually, it was Gabby, with the light from the bathroom mirror reflecting around her. But at the moment, all Helen saw was an angel. Gabby knew the minute she walked into the ladies' room what she was looking at when she saw Helen hugging the toilet bowl. Having been on the hill for as many decades as she had been, this wasn't the first time Gabby walked into the ladies' room on the hill only to find a young girl violently throwing up in the toilet. Damn those male senators. This was just the first time Gabby felt compelled to help. Gabby gently stroked Helen's back as Helen finished throwing up. Gabby then assisted Helen over to the sink and gestured for her to wash her face as she dug deep into her bag, looking for anything she might use to help freshen up Helen's appearance. Impressed with how quickly Helen was able to pull herself together, Gabby took the opportunity to introduce herself. Helen reciprocated, and then they both shared a laugh. Gabby already knew who the fourth youngest female to receive the Pulitzer Prize was, and Helen already knew who the legendary wire service correspondent and columnist was. Helen's thoughts folded into the present moment. Helen sat back further on her couch and smiled. What a moment in time that was, only to be outdone by Gabby insisting Helen take a pregnancy test and then having the test results come back negative. Helen recalled with some embarrassment that night before several of the young staffers Helen recalled with some embarrassment that the night before, several of the young staffers had gone out for a late night of partying at the local sushi bar. Helen wasn't pregnant. Helen had food poisoning. All 10 of the young staffers that went to the local sushi bar that night got food poisoning. Helen drifted off into sleep as she pondered what life would be like for her now if Gabby wasn't in her life. Right before she dozed off, she decided she never wanted to find out. The next day at work was a continuance of the chaos that had become the norm. Behind the scenes, conversations were focusing on finding a replacement vice president candidate. All agreed it should not be another senator. If another senator were to relinquish his or her seat, the governor of the respective states would be allowed to tap a replacement. This could tip the precarious party balance now existing in the Senate. Florida's governor was already in the process of identifying a replacement for Senator Baldwin's empty seat. Should the president win a second term but lose 2 Senate seats to the opposing party, her life would be hell. Given Helen's personal history of bad luck with senators, she couldn't help but feel an odd sense of relief. The president's party held a strong majority in the House of Representatives, so the focus was on various members of the House, as well as 2 favorable and very popular governors, and the Dean of International Studies at an Ivy League university, who himself was a former Secretary of State. The choice needed to be made quickly as the election was fast approaching, and the president and her running mate, whoever it might be, needed to restart actively campaigning. Helen had still not heard a word about any investigation into Senator Baldwin's death. Strangely, it was as if it had never happened. Helen went back to the list of suspects she and Gabby had put together, but still no one individual was the obvious culprit. Then Helen began to wonder about the current potential choices for vice president, 2 of them who had been lobbying hard for the position. The vice president position really held minimal power, performing primarily as a mouthpiece for the president, unless, of course, the president died or was impeached. However, there was the fact that the VP was the president of the Senate, able to cast a tie-breaking vote on any legislation before the Senate. What did the VP hopefuls have to gain? The most likely candidates would be from the South, just as Baldwin had been, to help sway those states to the president's camp. Was there hope by one candidate that a vice president he could expand drilling off the Gulf Coast and thus appease one of his major contributors? Was there hope by another that he could get the Bureau of Land Management to release multiple acres of land for development? Did either of those hopefuls knock off Baldwin? Helen shrugged at the thought. She needed Gabby's input. Attempting to exit the room for a brief phone call to Gabby, Helen froze in her tracks when she noticed the police detective she had met not too long ago after Senator Baldwin's death, speaking to the head of the Secret Service. Now what? Cautiously, Helen approached the detective and the head of Secret Service. All of her senses were on alert as she approached the pair who appeared to be engrossed in conversation. As she grew closer to the unlikely pair, Paul, the head of the Secret Service, looked up and greeted her with a frolicsome smile. "Good morning, Miss Smith. The detective here was just asking me where he could find you." Helen nodded toward Paul and said, "I've got this, Paul. and motioning the detective away from the crowd and off to a corner of the room. Looks like you found me, detective. How can I be of assistance? Is this regarding the incident the other night at the convenience store? Helen inquired. The detective, looking directly into Helen's eyes and without hesitation, said, No, ma'am. I would like to ask you to join me for dinner tonight at La Diplomate. You had mentioned it in the squad card that was your favorite restaurant, and I'd like to take you to dinner there. The detective didn't feel it was appropriate to tell her he was at the White House on official business and just happened to see her there. As had often become the case recently, Helen's first instinct was to turn around and run. Too many twists and turns in her recent life had made her quite skittish. Helen was socially astute enough to recognize that the detective had initially found her somewhat attractive, but not having seen nor heard from him since, she had put him out of her mind as anything other than someone who might put her in jail. She had not expected a dinner invitation and was at a momentary loss for words. She needed to process all this. The detective was obviously a good judge of people because he seemed to realize Helen's hesitation was not a rebuke, but simply time needed to formulate her thoughts. So he waited patiently and silently, but couldn't help a slight grin. The detective knew he shouldn't get involved with anyone connected in any way with any case he was working, but the convenience store matter had been put to bed, and in his mind, Helen was not even remotely a suspect in Senator Baldwin's death. And he did find Helen attractive, extremely attractive. More than that, he had read some of her work and knew she was wicked smart, which was so alluring to him. His only concern was if someone like Helen could possibly be interested in a relationship with a cop. Helen ultimately accepted the dinner invitation. What was the harm? She was lonely and he was uniquely appealing. She loved the restaurant and she could discreetly pick the detective's brain on the murder investigation. She remembered from their brief time together in the detective squad car that he had been easy to talk to, seemed intelligent, and been concerned about her well-being after her embarrassing panic attack. And his demeanor was pleasantly different from that of a pompous, self-absorbed politician she was used to. Helen just needed to be cautious because the detective was, after all, law enforcement. Even if he was engaging and ruggedly attractive in a man of action sort of way. They agreed the detective would pick her up the next night at 8 p.m. for dinner at Le Diplomate. As they parted ways, Helen set out down the great hall to her next assignment. Her thoughts began to wander. She couldn't remember the last time she'd gone out on a dinner date. Her relationships for the last 10 years had all been clandestine, and eating out in a public restaurant wasn't an option. Helen suddenly stopped dead in tracks. What was she going to wear? Did she have enough time to get her nails done? Due to her hectic schedule, her hair hadn't been attended to in months. She needed a hair appointment. She hadn't slept with anyone since Senator Baldwin. Did her feminine parts require some attention? What was she going to talk about? Last time she was alone with the detective, she benefited from liquid courage. Did he know anything about politics? Did she know anything besides politics? Helen started walking again, then picked up her pace. Before she knew it, she was in a full-blown run. She needed a nail appointment. She needed a hair appointment. She needed a bikini wax. She needed something to wear. She needed more time. At 7:59 p.m., the doorman buzzed Helen's studio apartment. She heard the buzz, but she was unable to respond. Helen's nails were still wet when she put on her newly purchased form-fitting mini dress, trying desperately not to mess up her freshly coiffed hair, and she was stuck. Wearing her favorite pair of red stilettos and a new pair of Spanx, Helen had managed to shimmy only part of the dress down her body before it would go no further. She managed to avoid disturbing her hair. She managed to avoid damaging the freshly painted nails, but she did not manage to get the entire dress over her breasts. Evidently, in her haste, Helen had missed seeing there was a side zipper. Helen was stuck, arms overhead, dress halfway on. sporting her favorite pair of red stilettos. Helen was contemplating her next move when she heard a determined knocking at the door. Realizing she had no choice, Helen cautiously maneuvered her way over to the door. Standing away from the door and bending over at a 90-degree angle so her hand could turn the knob, Helen reluctantly opened the door to her apartment. For an amazingly accomplished, intelligent person, she couldn't help but be totally mortified at the impression she was making on the detective. The next reading will be episode 6, The Mighty Finn. It'll take place in a small town in New Jersey. Thank you for listening. This is the end of the stream.